morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's Shelley Moore, and I am back to read you another one of my short stories. I'm very excited because if you follow me, you know it's been a while since I've recorded one, and I actually didn't just write this one. I wrote this, probably a year ago or so. It didn't make it into the book because I hadn't recorded it yet, and so I wanted to make sure that everything that I had in the book when it was released were available on my YouTube channel as free audiobooks. So, with that being said, let's talk about my book. My book, A Heaping Handful of Horror, a collection of original short stories, was released a few months ago. It's available on Amazon.com. It currently still has a perfect 5-star rating, which I'm very, very excited about. I don't want to jinx it, but I'm very excited about it. And I'm going to be doing a giveaway here soon. I bought these cool bookmarks that look like monster hands that come out of the book. I have 2 of them, so I'm going to give away 2 signed copies of my book along with these super cool bookmarks, which hopefully I can put a little picture of right now. Dun, dun, dun. And I'm going to have the entry form for that on my website. So hopefully I'll give those away here shortly. And I'm going to try not to talk too much before this audiobook, but if you know me and follow me, as almost 500 of you do, you know that I like to chit-chat a little bit before my books because I like it to feel like I'm just a friend who's, sitting beside you reading you a scary story. So we're going to talk about my old hound dog. I love animals, but my old hound dog is 16 years old. He's very geriatric. He's very senile. He can't see very well. He can't hear. He can't smell anymore. So when I leave the room, which I usually do to record these books, I go down in the basement because it's the quietest room of the house, right? I can't do that anymore because if I leave the room, the hound dog howls, and it's very loud. And we live in a small house, so it can absolutely be heard. He's destroyed many an audiobook that I've tried recording. So today I'm actually sitting in my living room, maybe 5 feet from him as he's sleeping. I've got my little dog here on my legs sleeping, and my cat is about 10 feet away. So you might hear noises. I'm going to try to make this as professional as possible. But really, I genuinely just wanted to get another audiobook out there because it has been so long since I've put one out. So I dug this one out of the depths on my rusty dusty laptop here, and I thought, I'm going to record this one. Let's record this one and put it out there, and hopefully you guys like it. The name of the story is The Mind, and it's written by myself, Shelley Moore, for my website, limitlessstimulus.com. No matter how well you think you may know a person, the truth is you may not truly know them at all. Your children will keep secrets from you. Your spouse, your best friends of 20 plus years, your parents, and your siblings all have secrets of which you will likely never be made aware. Even if the secret is what the person who holds it would label as insignificant, there's still a possibility that whatever it is could be something that would wildly and profoundly alter the way you'd forever think of them. The parents who proudly proclaim, "I've raised my children in such a way that there are no secrets between us," are perhaps the most sorely mistaken. The friend who brags about her long-time committed relationship and how it blissfully thrives due to a total lack of secrecy, unfortunately, also sadly mistaken. No one, I repeat, no one shares all of their deepest and darkests with someone, even if they themselves truly, deeply believe they have absolutely confessed it all to an open ear. Bits are always omitted, whether by conscious or subconscious choice. It's a bit like taking a bite of toast. Tiny crumbs inevitably always fall and will never reach your mouth. A person can choose to live their life openly and honestly, exhaustively and transparently revealing their truths to both friends and strangers alike, and yet still fail to express their every breadcrumb. The issue, if you want to call it that, lies within our minds. The human mind is an infinite, miraculous, incredible, yet desperately fickle thing which both illustrates and gives dimension to every microscopic detail of the lives we lead. There's a blanket I've owned for years in which dozens of people, including myself and my children, have argued over the color. It is a brown blanket. The packaging in which it came describes it as such. The internet listing on the store's website lists it as such. When I see it, I clearly see no other color but chocolate brown. Yet it seems half of the people I show it to will say it's gray, and will tell you to think otherwise is completely absurd and completely incorrect. Those of us who see it as a brown blanket think those who see gray must carry a touch of colorblindness, preventing them from seeing its true shade. Perhaps, if you don't live under a rock, you've seen similar things floating around the internet in which a dress or a pair of shoes are shown and it asks a seemingly simple question. What color is this item? The internet will be so divided that tempers will inevitably ridiculously flare and arguments will abound. The scientific types will lay out their conclusions in detail as if their very career depended on the correct answer. It's quite silly, albeit incredibly entertaining, to read through all the comments in one of those posts. Statistics say that approximately 1 in 12 men in the world are colorblind, while colorblindness only affects 1 in 200 women. It all boils down to evolution. Historically, men were the hunters, while women picked berries and other earth-grown foods, which meant a woman had to know beyond the shadow of a doubt the various shades of fruits and vegetables to determine ripeness. A woman had to decipher countless shades of red berries, for example, for her very survival. Just a touch too dark or too light, and she could potentially poison and kill her entire family or even her entire tribe. Evolutionarily speaking, men had no real need for such intricate color viewing, so they've evolved as such. When I refer to the mind versus the brain, it may or may not be a stretch for you to understand most consider these are two separate entities. The brain is considered the computer of the physical human body. It tells your fingers when and how to type, your legs when and how to walk, your lungs when and how to expand, your heart when and how to beat, your eyes when and how to open and close, and your bowels when and how to release, etc. This amazing human computer, aka brain, continues to operate while the mind can get completely lost in thought for substantial periods of time. The brain keeps on trucking. The brain, as long as it is able, will continue to do what it needs to do to keep us functioning. The mind absolutely battles the brain, however, and can prevent it from doing even the most mundane, automatic of processes. Try it out. Using your thoughts, your mind, right now, tell your brain to stop your lungs from inhaling. Boom. You interrupted the computer, your brain, using your mind. We can lose our minds, yet our bodies will continue to function properly, thanks due to the brain. On the flip side of that, parts of the brain can malfunction while the mind continues to function properly, such as the cases in which an anesthesia patient awakens during an operation. Their entire body remains paralyzed and completely unable to communicate the horror they are experiencing until the drug's effect on the brain-body wears off. Our minds can create sickness, both physical and mental, with terrifying ease. This is why placebo pharmaceuticals work so well in double-blind trials. A group of 100 people can be told they're being given a revolutionary new weight loss pill. Half of the test subjects receive a simple sugar pill made to look identical to the actual medication, while the other half will receive the actual pill. Interestingly, up to 90% or more of the test subjects, whether given the actual drug or placebo, will lose weight and swear the new medication worked wonders. Our minds can create unnecessary hardship and struggle with equally terrifying ease. Our minds create issues that simply did not exist before the mind created them, such as convincing ourselves an innocent spouse must be cheating, or dealing with rejection before the rejectee has even spoken a single word to the rejector. We store past traumas within the brain so the mind can use them for our supposed survival, evolutionarily speaking. We once had to know the specific sound a twig makes when snapped under the weight of a predator's paw, so we've evolved to thrust ourselves into fight or flight when we pick up on the smallest, seemingly most insignificant of cues. An example would be that perhaps an unfaithful ex of yours used to be on their phone too often. So when you begin a new relationship, if you consider the new person to be on their phone excessively, you may subconsciously begin pulling away from them both physically and emotionally because your mind is warning you of the potential danger of being hurt again. We misread and completely misunderstand body language from others because we assume their body language is the same as our own, or those we've spent our lives around. We even manage to read text messages in the wrong tone somehow, and actually become upset with a person. It's akin to pulling an iffy block from a Jenga stack. From your side of the Jenga stack, the block seems like a fine choice, but if you sat opposite yourself, you'd see it was a terrible choice. We assume based on what we feel we know incorrectly, and it creates an invisible but crucial imbalance moving forward. The problem is we simply don't know any better. We're only operating at the level in which we are able in any given moment, and we seldom realize our error until it's too late. There are humans that exist across the globe called tetrachromats, who have one extra type of cone inside their eyes, which allows them to see a fourth dimensionality of colors. If you look it up on the interwebs, it'll tell you it's caused by a genetic mutation and that, not shockingly, most tetrachromats are, in fact, women. The following story is about a tetrachromat whose abilities were unlocked through traumatic injury. Through this newly unlocked superhuman ability, she was able to see the real truth of the world and not just the version we've come to accept as our reality. Elizabeth Lissy Harris adjusted her new office chair to accommodate her short legs. She laughed to herself as she considered the fact that she couldn't exactly display the dominance and power her new position required while swinging her legs beneath her chair like an excited toddler. She began to remove her personal items and files from the boxes, which had recently been brought up to her new office by Jones, the office intern and Lissy's good friend, along with a fresh cup of coffee with no cream and 2 sugars. "Here you go, Miss Elizabeth. It's hot," he said as he gently set it on the desk. "Thanks, Jonesy. I appreciate it," she said with a warm smile to her friend. "And ew, please don't call me that." "Not a problem, especially for the new boss lady," Jones replied with a wink. "Gotta up my ass-kissing game, I guess." "My ass doesn't need kissing. Not by you, anyway." Lissy laughed as she began putting files into her new desk drawers. "Half of the building still have steam pouring out of their collective ears," Jones said quietly. "They'll get over it," Lissy replied. "No one can believe Martin picked you over Charlie. I mean, no offense, Liz. It's just that Charlie's been here since the dinosaurs roamed 5th and Broadway instead of BMWs and women in short skirts and homeless Harold down there," Jones said as he looked out of the window in Lissy's 11th floor office. "Oh my God, Jonesy, this coffee is so much better than our shit coffee on the 3rd floor. That's just not even fair," Lissy said as she sipped her hot coffee. "Shit coffee is reserved for the bourgeois, Liz. You're high class now, not a mere peasant," the flamboyant Jones replied sarcastically in a regal tone. "Well, I'm all for it if it means I get to drink coffee this good every morning," Lissy said. "Well, you're damn near royalty now, Liz. You shit gold up here on the 11th floor. Speaking of which, I hear the bathrooms up here have golden shitters," Jones joked. Lissy pursed her lips and rolled her eyes at him. "Doubtful, Jonesy, but I am definitely grateful they let you move up here with me instead of assigning me a new intern," Lissy said. "You and me both, darling. I look forward to rubbing elbows and asses with the 11th floor royalty," Jones joked. "Maybe their royalty will rub off on me and I'll be promoted from office bitch to head of something. What is it we do up here on the 11th floor anyway, Liz?" Lissy set a framed photo of herself and her Boston Terrier mix, Loogie, on the far left corner of her desk and then replied, "Hell, I don't know. Something to do with books, I'd hope." She was joking, of course, and Jones laughed as he said, "Hopefully, otherwise you're screwed. I don't think you know much of anything else outside of books, do you, Liz? Lissy threw a rubber band ball the size of a softball at his head, but he ducked just in time for it to pass by and hit the noisy metal blinds on her office window. I'm reporting you for abuse, Jones joked as he picked up the rubber ball and tossed it back to Lissy. Do it, please. I could use the vacation, Lissy joked back. Lissy's office phone rang. They both dashed for it, but Jones made it there first. He picked up the receiver and said, The office of Miss Elizabeth Harris. Jones speaking. How can I assist you on this glorious, partly cloudy day? Okay. No, she's free at noon for lunch. Crispy's work? Okay, not a problem. Great. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, you too. Bye-bye. Who was that? Lissy asked. Sherman Oatley's annoying-ass assistant. You're having lunch with Mr. Oatley at noon at Crispy's on 2nd Street, Jones replied. Lissy grumbled dramatically. You've been putting it off for weeks, Liz. Put your big girl panties on and just get it over with, Jones said. I hate Crispy's, Lizzie protested. I know, Jones smiled mischievously. That's why I picked it. Sherman is such a wet blanket, Lissy said. I know, Jones agreed. I really hate you, Lissy said as she grabbed her jacket from the coat hook and opened her office door. You love me, Jones replied. Finish unpacking my stuff while I'm gone. That's your punishment. Lissy blew him a kiss, which he pretended to catch and then toss into the trash can. Then she closed her office door behind her. As she walked down the bustling city street, she gently pulled her collar up to cover her exposed neck. It was winter in New England, although no snow had yet fallen, and she regretted having such a short hairstyle on blustery days such as these. She secretly loved the sound her high heels made as they made contact with the sidewalk, a sound that made her mind think power. She took each step deliberately and intently, and smiled because with this new position at work and the new office, she felt very powerful indeed. Just as she rounded the corner of 4th and Simmons Street, just before she approached Clara's Floral Market, which she had become a regular at over the years, a man grabbed Lissy around her waist. His hand covered her mouth with brutal force in an attempt to silence her. The man dragged her deeper into the alleyway as she kicked and flailed with every fiber of strength she had within her petite body. His gargantuan hand covered her mouth so tightly it ached, causing any plea she released into the air around her to be far too muffled to be heard by any passerby. She tried kicking him again and again, but her small frame underneath the weight of his was a pathetically unfair, outweighted match. Shh, shh, he repeated to her several times as he pinned her to the ground with his hand still covering her mouth. He was using the entirety of his body weight as a weapon, crushing her to where she struggled desperately to find any space within her lungs in which to allow oxygen. I'll remove my hand if you promise not to scream, little girl. If you scream, I'll cut your throat, he said as he kissed her neck, and then traced the spots in which he had kissed with the sharp edge of a box cutter. I'll cut you from one ear to the other. You got it? Hot, heavy tears fell from the corners of her eyes as she begrudgingly nodded her head in agreement. He slowly removed his hand, which smelled of motor oil and filth. Her bottom lip had been split in 2 separate places, and crimson blood began to trickle down her chin and cheek. Please don't, she begged quietly through desperate tears. The man laughed, then kissed the bloody corner of her mouth as he unzipped his pants. Please don't, she begged again quietly. Please, please don't. He raised her skirt with one hand as he held himself up with the other. Lissy cried as she turned her head toward the street in the hopes of catching the attention of a passerby. The streets had been so busy as she walked them just moments earlier. She began to wonder how no one had noticed the man snatch her. She saw no one pass the alleyway in the moments when she most needed someone to be there. She began to disassociate, her mind removing her from that horrifying situation and carrying her inside the flower shop just beyond the brick wall. The brick wall in which the top of her head hit violently now with each forceful thrust. She smelled the heavenly floral fragrance, inhaling the roses and lilies deeply. She admired the sunflowers, wondering who was able to grow such massive, beautiful sunflowers in such cold temperatures. She noticed the shopkeeper, Clara, whom she had become quite good friends with over the years, tending to the yellow mini roses, delicately and lovingly plucking dead leaves from their stems. She noticed the pretty, albeit quiet young girl who sometimes helped Clara at her shop, standing beside her, simply observing as she plucked. The young girl turned to Lissy, smiled, and said, "Good morning, Lissy." Lissy, a bit taken aback because she had never been addressed by the little girl before, automatically replied, "Good morning." The girl, who looked to be about 8 years old, replied, "Oh my gosh! Hi! My name is Brooke. I'm Clara's daughter. It's so very nice to meet you. Mama likes you a lot." "It's so very nice to meet you as well, Brooke. I like your mother quite a bit as well. She was one of the first friends I made when I moved here to the city," Lissy replied. "Mama says the same about you," Brooke replied. "Is that so? You guys aren't from the city?" Lissy asked. "No, ma'am. We used to have a big old farmhouse with cows and chickens and even a big old horse named Clyde out in Boonestown. We even had 2 extra bedrooms we didn't even use because the house was just so big. I love that house," Brooke said a bit somberly. Lissy turned her attention to Clara and said, "Good morning, Clara. It's so nice to finally meet your daughter. She's lovely." Clara didn't seem to neither hear nor notice Lissy. "She can't hear me either," Brooke said. "What do you mean?" Lissy asked, confused, before walking over to Clara's side. "Clara," she said, as she waved her hand in front of Clara's face. Clara had no reaction. "Are you dead too?" Brooke asked innocently. "Dead? No." "What? You're not dead, silly girl. I'm not dead," Lissy said. "Yes, I am," Brooke stated, as if she had been offended by Lissy's words. "I died because a man drank beer and drove his car into Mama's." Lissy, believing Brooke must have a very active imagination for her age, turned away from Clara to face her daughter. Brooke was no longer a pretty little thing with long, beautiful blonde hair and a blue and white dress with white shoes. Now she stood nude before Lissy, her frail body covered in blood and gore. The right side of her body was disfigured beyond recognition. Half of her skull was missing, her eye, her jaw, all gone. Her skin was mostly gone, exposing bone and muscle, tendons and ligaments from the shoulders down. Her right arm hung lifelessly at her side, connected by a fraction of flesh, while her intestines poured out of her badly beaten body and onto the floor beside her. Lissy gasped and cried out in horror, taking several steps back away from the girl before bumping into the wall of the shop and sliding down to the floor. She drew her knees into her chest and covered her mouth with her hands. "This is what that man did to me," little Brooke said. "It made Mama very, very sad. So she left my daddy in the big old house and she moved to the city to start over." Lissy couldn't stand to look at her in such a condition. She closed her eyes tight and began praying the Lord's Prayer. Brooke walked slowly toward her. "I didn't want Mama to be lonely," Brooke continued as she walked. Lissy covered her eyes with her hands and prayed to wake up from this horrid dream. When she withdrew her hands from her face, the little girl, Brooke, was squatting down just inches from her, but no longer appearing as a ravaged, bloody corpse. The adorable little blonde girl presented once again as she had been in life. "I didn't mean to scare you, Lissy. I'm sorry," Brooke apologized. As Brooke reached for Lissy's hand, her head quickly snapped towards the exposed brick wall, the wall opposite of where Lissy now sat. "Oh, no," Brooke said. "Oh, no. Oh, no. Lissy, something very bad is happening to you." Lissy could only stare at Brooke, confused. "You aren't dead. You're alive, but the man outside," she shouted as she stood and ran, disappearing through the solid brick wall. After a moment, Lissy slowly began to rise from her seated position. Brooke suddenly reappeared inside the shop and grabbed Lissy by the hand. "Come on, we have to stop him." Brooke said, as she pulled Lissy across the shop and then through the brick wall. Lissy had instinctually closed her eyes and braced herself for impact with her free arm before being pulled through, but, to her astonishment, when she opened her eyes once again, she stood in the alleyway beside the shop. Brooke pointed down toward the man violently assaulting the woman in front of them. Lissy immediately began shouting, "Get off of her! Help! Someone help her!" She pounded on the man's back and feverishly tried to push him away from the poor woman who laid helplessly beneath him, unconscious. "Brooke, call the cops!" Lissy shouted, but Brooke just stood beside them, cocking her head slightly and giving her a supremely befuddled look. I can't," Brooke replied. "Remember? I'm dead." Lissy continued beating on the man's back and shouting for help, but nothing seemed to release his hold on this woman. In fact, the man seemed to pay less attention to her futile attempts to stop the attack than he would if a pesky mosquito had been buzzing in his ear. She wept as she shouted profanities at the man before eventually giving up and falling to the ground beside them, heartbroken, powerless, and defeated. "Lissy," Brooke said as she hugged her tightly, "look at the woman. Look at her." "We have to find help," she said as she took Brooke by the hand. Brooke stood firm and shook her hand loose from Lissy's. She said, "Lissy, you have to look at her." Lissy dropped to the ground in tears, then crawled on her hands and knees until she could clearly see the woman's bloodied, beaten face. It was her. She was the victim. The moment the realization struck her, she was immediately slammed back into her body. The physical pain sustained in the attack hit her like a sack of bricks. As she slowly, perhaps too slowly, came to, she grabbed a handful of dirt and rock from beside her and threw it directly into her attacker's eyes. Reflexively, he immediately brought his hands to his eyes and yelled, "You bitch!" She was able to use that crucial moment to get out from underneath him and run down the alleyway and into the flower shop. She locked the door behind her and shouted, "Call the police!" Clara was so startled by the sudden theatrics, she knocked over 2 terracotta potted plants, which shattered upon impact, their soil scattering across the shop's linoleum floor. "My God, Lissy, what happened?" Clara shouted as she picked up her cell phone and began dialing. "A man attacked me in the alley," Lissy said, as she limped weakly to the counter and collapsed behind it. When Lissy awoke, her head laid in Clara's lap as emergency services worked on her body. "It's okay, Lissy. You're safe now. They caught the man, too. He's in police custody. You're safe," Clara said calmly and lovingly as she stroked Lissy's hair. Brooke stood just behind Clara with tears falling from her little eyes, but she wore a bittersweet smile on her face. As the fog of unconscious began to leave her eyes, she noticed vibrant colors swirling all around Clara, Brooke, and the paramedics. Shades of purples and turquoise, yellows and greens, and even a multitude of colors that she had no name for, danced within the subtle movements of each person as smoke would from an extinguished flame. "You didn't die," Brooke said. "And you can still see me. Bonus!" Brooke had a glow around her that was so bright it was almost like trying to look into the summer sun. As the girl moved, streaks of color filled the air around her as if her fingers were made of brightly colored ink, while her skin of pure sunlight. Lissy smiled at Clara, but wept silently as her wounds were treated. The paramedics loaded her onto a gurney and transported her to a nearby hospital in an ambulance. Clara accompanied her friend to the hospital, as did little Brooke. What should have been a sterile hospital room had somehow become a colorful display of shimmering rainbows. What should be white, such as the coats worn by the doctors, and the machinery which beeped and buzzed around her, became more like mosaics of all the various shades of white, plus rainbows of colors infused throughout. Things that were black, such as the television and Clara's hair, carried vibrant hues of violet, emerald, and indigo. Skin tones were dramatically boldened. Clara's normally pale pink cheeks now appeared a deep crimson. Lissy could clearly see the green veins in Clara's arms through her skin, as if someone had outlined them with a green Crayola marker. There were 4 nurses in the room with them, which Lissy thought to be a bit excessive, and their collective glow, along with the multidimensional colors of their scrubs, were so bright it was overwhelming. Lissy closed her eyes to turn it all off for a moment. "Rest is a good idea," Clara said quietly, as she began to stand from the chair in which she had been seated at Lissy's bedside. I'll head on down to the cafeteria and see if I can't find us something to munch on." No, please stay. I'm not going to get much rest with all these people in here anyway," Lissy said. "What kind of drugs did they give me?" Clara looked around the room and said, "What people, Lizzie? It's just you and me." Lissy opened her eyes and looked again around the room. 4 nurses, Brooke, Clara, and herself. 2 nurses worked together at a machine on her left while 1 wrote on a clipboard. The 4th sat in the windowsill and simply smiled back at her. "The nurses, I mean," Lissy explained as she closed her eyes once again and threw her arm over her face to help shield the light from her sensitive eyes. "There are no nurses in here right now, Lissy," Clara said, very concerned. Lissy's eyes reopened. The nurses hadn't moved. The room was full of people, uncomfortably so. Can I just have a moment alone with my friend?" Lissy asked the nurses, politely yet with a hint of exasperation. Clara looked around the room, bewildered and with her concern growing as the 4 nurses left. 1 nurse lovingly patted Lissy's foot on her way out and smiled kindly. "Can I stay?" Brooke asked. "Of course," Lissy replied. "Yay!" Brooke celebrated as she jumped on the foot of the bed. "Of course what?" Clara asked. "No, sorry, I wasn't actually talking to you, Clara," Lissy tried to explain. "Lissy, you're scaring me a bit. Maybe we should call a nurse." "No, I'm fine," Lissy said. "Truly, I am." "No offense, Lissy, but I really don't think you are," Clara said as she reached for the nurse's call button. Lissy grabbed it and tucked it under her back so Clara couldn't reach it. "Clara, oh my God, I can't believe I'm about to do this, but listen, please, I really, really don't mean to get so intrusively, agonizingly personal, so I truly, madly, deeply apologize for what I'm about to say, but I promise it'll help you understand," Lissy said. You've been through a serious trauma, Lissy, so your brain might be doing some strange thing." "Did you have a daughter named Brooke?" Lissy interrupted. Clara was stunned into silence. A drunk driver crashed into your car and killed her, right?" Lissy asked. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she remained silent. After a moment of hesitation, she gently nodded her head. "She was beautiful. Long blonde hair, big green eyes?" Lissy asked. "How do you... I never told you," Clara mumbled as tears fell steadily down her cheeks. "She's right here, Clara. She's right there at the end of my bed. She's sitting cross-legged, twirling her hair around her fingers," Lissy said. "What?" Clara said as she looked feverishly at the end of the hospital bed, but saw nothing. "I don't know why I can see her, Clara, but I can," Lissy said. You must have read a news article or something. I'm not some creeper, Clara. Come on. What would my agenda be? She's right here. She told me about how you left your husband in your big farmhouse with 2 empty rooms, cows, chickens, and a horse named Clyde because you wanted a new start. Clara's bottom jaw fell open. "She's right here, Clara. I wish you could see her," Lissy said as she began to cry as well, although she wasn't sure if her tears were due to frustration, exhaustion, or empathy. After a full minute of silence, Clara began to wrap her mind around what Lissy had revealed to her. Brooke said, "Tell her I love her and I'm not mad at her." "I think she probably already knows that," Lissy said to Brooke. "Just tell her!" Brooke yelled. "Goodness gracious, calm down," she said to Brooke before turning to Clara and saying, "She says to tell you she loves you and she's not mad at you." Clara replied as she wept. It's been 6 years, and I never told anyone, but I thought she'd be mad at me because I lived, and she didn't. She had her whole life ahead of her, and I had already lived so long, and it just wasn't fair. Clara collapsed, weeping heavily into her hands. I'm not mad, Mama. Tell her, Lissy, tell her I was never mad, Brooke said as she hugged her mother. Oh, and the nurses are dead people. She's never been mad, and the nurses are dead. Lissy began repeating to Clara what Brooke had said, but then quickly realized that last part was intended just for her. Wait, what? Yeah, I guess you can see all of us now, Brooke replied. Weird. What's she saying? Clara asked, completely confused. She said she thinks I can see dead people, all of them. The nurses I saw in the room they were ghosts, I guess, Lissy explained as she tried to wrap her own mind around it all. I don't feel like a ghost. I just feel like me, Brooke said. Can you see all the colors? Lissy asked Brooke. Brooke raised an eyebrow at Lissy as she continued clinging to her mother. Are you actually talking to my daughter right now? Clara interrupted. Yes, Lissy replied to Clara with compassion, but then to Brooke she quickly asked, You don't see the colors and the lights? You mean the people glow? Brooke asked. Lissy nodded. Everyone has a glow. Dead people have a bigger glow. Some people have super-duper bright glows like the sun, and some just have like barely little there itsy-teeny-weeny glows like my old SpongeBob nightlight, Brooke explained. Lissy asked, But you don't see the colors? I mean, like your hospital gown is blue, your hair is brown, Mom's hair is black, Mom's shoes are, oh my God, they're so fancy. Tell her I love them, Brooke said excitedly. Tell her! She likes your shoes, Lissy said to Brooke's mother. Both women smiled. She helped me back there, you know. Helped you how? Clara asked through tears. At your shop, when the man was... Anyway, she helped me. I guess somehow I left my body and I went into your shop and there she was. She's always been there. I've always seen her with you and I just never realized you couldn't see her. I had no idea. How could I have known? I just thought she was quiet. Nothing wrong with being a little shy. I assumed she was a helper, a niece maybe, or just some neighborhood kid you'd let help out from time to time. How long has she been with me? Clara asked through a voice cracking with emotion. Since I got smushed, Brooke said, and without a second thought, Lissy repeated, Since she got smushed. Oh my God, Brooke, no, I'm not saying that to your poor mother. Since she passed, Clara. She hasn't left your side since she passed. Clara sobbed into her hands. Please tell her I'm hugging her, Brooke pleaded to Lissy. She's hugging you right now. I wish you could see her, Clara. I wish I could pass this to you somehow, even just for a minute. She's beautiful. When she smiles, she has these two big temples. You can only see them when she smiles really big. Clara laughed through her tears. I miss you so much, my Brookie baby. Oh, I wish I could hug you back. A doctor walked into the room, and Lissy quietly mouthed, Is he real? They both quickly and inconspicuously, Brooke forgetting for a moment that she couldn't be seen, nodded yes. Behind the doctor stood two others, a male and a female, dressed in long, shimmering, multicolored robes with light emanating so brightly from their beings that it flooded the room and made it difficult for Lissy to keep her eyes open. They were clearly not from this world, their stunning ethereality both beautiful and completely overwhelming. They're helpers. They help the doctor heal people, Brooke explained as the doctor began to speak. She seemed to pick the knowledge up telepathically, as no words had been exchanged between them. Miss Harris, you've been through quite an ordeal. I'm so sorry, truly, he said. He placed his hand on Lissy's, and she watched curiously as waves of light pulsed from his body into hers as he spoke. She could feel his light as it entered her body. It felt calm, gentle, fluid. and she somehow inherently knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was healing her energetically with the help of the invisible, ethereal beings that stood just behind him. The ethereal man spoke just as the doctor paused, saying, "You have always had the gift of vision, dear Elizabeth, but it had been muted until this event." The doctor then continued speaking to Lissy, while the ethereal beings continued as well, speaking over him. Lissy desperately tried to focus on both conversations, but found herself far more interested in what the ethereal beings had to say. As the doctor continued speaking, the ethereal woman said, "Now, sweet Elizabeth, you see what is, all that is real and remains unseen in this world by others." Brooke sat cross-legged at the end of the bed, staring up in awe at the ethereal beings as they spoke. "They're so beautiful," Brooke said. The ethereal woman looked down at her, smiled warmly, and said, "As are you, child, as are you." The ethereal man then looked down at Brooke and said, "You do not belong here, child. You must go home." His words weren't meant callously, but instead as an abrupt reminder that Brooke was, in fact, deceased, and no one, especially a child, should be left stuck on this earthly plane. "I need to be with my mama," Brooke said to them defiantly. "You are confusing your wants with your needs, dear child," the ethereal woman said. "You are needed back home," the ethereal man said. "I'm not moving a single butt muscle until I know my mama will be okay." Brooke crossed her arms as she spoke to them. The ethereal woman smiled affectionately and glided effortlessly across the floor toward the child. She said, "Dearest child, your mother's journey cannot begin until you've left her side. The purpose of her life, this life she's living now, is to experience grief and, more importantly, to heal from it. Her soul cannot do so until you've left her side. Until then, dear child, she'll continue to feel as if you are just out of her reach. It will torture her soul until the day she passes, thereby tethering her to this earth. If you truly want to help her, you'll need to leave her and allow her to heal." After a moment of careful consideration and several tears falling from her cheeks to the bed beneath her, Brooke lunged across the bed and wrapped herself around her mother. In that moment, Clara gasped and looked at Lissy with eyes as wide as the moon. Lissy smiled and nodded her head as confirmation. Clara could feel the final embrace of her deceased daughter. Clara closed her eyes and relished in the feeling, a feeling she'd long thought she'd never get to experience again. As she did, her glow and the glow of her daughter's spirit both grew exponentially, filling the room with a brightness Lissy had to reluctantly shield her eyes from momentarily. As the doctor left the room, so too did the ethereal man and woman who held Brooke's hand in her own as they crossed the threshold and disappeared. The colors and lights never disappeared from Lissy's vision. She simply learned to live with them. The doctors had formally diagnosed her as tetrachromat, yet she was never told she possessed the fourth cone within her eyes. She couldn't remember any testing done to confirm the diagnosis either, but it seemed to explain her newfound superhuman abilities well enough, so she didn't bother to argue it. It was much easier to tell people she had a migraine caused by tetrachromacy than to explain she had been traumatically assaulted, which subsequently opened up a part of her brain that allowed her not only to see 100 times more color than the average human being, but also the ability to see the very vibrancy of a person's soul, dead people, and even sickness and ailments within a human body. She continued to work at the publishing company, but in addition now held a part-time position in a hospice care center, in which she dutifully helped people of various ages pass from this world to the next without the invisible tethers of unprocessed emotion, so their souls could go back to wherever it is that we souls go after we shed these heavy, burdened bodies. A new resident was admitted into the facility this morning, in which Lissy had been directly assigned as his aide. His name was Gunther Frank Gones IV. A meeting had been held the previous day in which everyone in the building had been warned before his arrival of his combative, sometimes violent behavior. When Frank was brought into the building, he immediately shouted profanities at the staff, spat on the shoes of the aide who pushed his wheelchair, and threatened the lives of 4 different staff members. Lissy walked into his room after giving him an hour to settle. He had fallen asleep in his reclining chair with the television on so loudly she could hardly hear her own thoughts. She announced herself as she walked into his room, but he, of course, wouldn't have been able to hear a train crashing through the wall beside him. She headed toward the sleeping man and carefully removed the remote control from his lap to turn the noisy television off. As she set the remote onto the table beside Frank, she caught movement out of her peripheral. She glanced up at the peaceful-looking, snoring, drooling old man, and to her amazement, to her shock, and her horror, a small being no bigger than a house cat clung to his back, its claws deeply embedded into his flesh. It snarled and growled at her, its jagged teeth dripping with saliva and some sort of thick black ooze. Its eyes glowed red-hot like molten lava, and the hatred she felt from it was thick, oppressive, and highly palpable. It snapped, snarled, and bit at her viciously as it realized she could see it. The entity bit down hard on Frank's neck, at which point he awoke abruptly and began shouting, "You sneaky little bitch, coming in my room while I'm sleeping, stealing my things, taking my money, trying to kill me? You whore! You filthy whore! Get the hell out of my room!" "Frank, Mr. Gones, I'm so sorry. I would never," she tried to explain calmly. "Liar! Liar! Get out! Help! Help!" he yelled as the creature bit down again and again. But Lissy saw something in the man's eyes that caught her off guard. While his words were volatile, vulgar, and vicious, his eyes were sad. They were horribly sad, desperately sad. They filled with tears and seemed to silently cry, "Help me, please, for the love of God, help me." The ethereal woman's voice spoke within Lizzie's mind and simply said, "Help him." Lissy understood at once his hostility was being caused by this evil parasitic entity which had somehow attached itself to him at some point in his life. As she approached the man, the hideous, black-scaled, foul-smelling entity backed cautiously away from her, shielding its eyes from her bright glow with its falcon-like talons. She somehow understood in that moment that light would drive the beast's darkness out. She might actually be able to help this man like the ethereal woman had asked of her. She had to try, she had to know, but the closer she got to the man, the increasingly vile he became. "You whore bitch! Get out of my room! Help! Help! Someone help me! She's trying to kill me! You bitch!" Spittle flew from his lips as he shouted, while tears fell from the corners of his eyes to his lap below. Like a dog, trapped and caged, fearing for its life, who lashes out aggressively purely out of fear for its very survival, this man was battling this evil entity internally. His brain and body had been overtaken by the beast, while his mind cried out desperately for help. Lissy sat beside him and took his hands in hers. He repeatedly pulled away, but each time he did, she delicately, calmly, and lovingly take them in hers again and again until his mind finally overcame the beast's control just enough to allow it. Tears fell continuously down his wrinkled, sun-spotted cheeks, and although the profanity continued to spew from his lips, his voice gradually lowered in its volume. Lissy kissed his hands and held them tightly between both of hers. She said, "Your body might not be strong enough to fight, Frank, but your mind is, so fight. Fight, damn it. Don't allow this to be the end of your story, Frank." He immediately quieted, and the beast shrieked, infuriated beyond measure. "I want you to remember, Frank, what it felt like to be loved. Were you married?" she asked as she held his hand tightly, ignoring the beast and focusing on the man fighting for his life inside of its host. After a moment, Frank nodded slowly, just barely, just enough. "Remember your wife, Frank? Was she pretty?" Lissy asked. Frank slowly nodded again, and she thought she saw the faintest twitch at the corners of his mouth, as if a smile had attempted to form it but had not yet been permitted. "With a looker like you, Frank, I can believe it. Remember how much you loved her. Remember the feeling you'd have when you'd hold her, that energy coursing through your body. Remember the first time you made love, Frank. Remember your wedding day. Remember and try to feel that love coursing through your veins," Lissy said, and then she leaned down to whisper in his ear, "Because that's how we fight off this bastard, Frank." Frank's light, his aura, a barely there glow when he had first arrived at the facility, grew as Lizzie spoke, and as the glow grew, the beast struggled to cling to Frank's body. "Do you have children, Frank?" she asked, and Frank's glow immediately amplified. With his free hand, without lifting it, he weakly held out 3 trembling fingers. 3 children. Wow, Frank, you must have had your hands full." She joked, and the corner of Frank's mouth raised the tiniest bit as his glow continued to gradually amplify. "Think of the day you brought each of them home from the hospital. Think of your house, how full of love it was," she continued. Frank began to speak. I love them so much. So damn much." The beast clawed at his back and sunk its teeth into his neck again and again, desperately attempting to regain its control. It hissed, snarled, and shrieked noisily as Lissy spoke. "I know you did, Frank. I don't doubt that for a second. Now think about how much they loved you," she pleaded. The creature sank its claws into the sides of Frank's neck and bit down on the back. Frank's demeanor changed immediately. "They all died," he said, as tears continued to fall down his sodden cheeks. Suddenly his glow began to diminish as the entity regained its grip. He said spitefully, "They left me with nothing, all alone. I got no one." The beast threw its head back and howled with delight as it sank its claws deeper into the flesh of its host. Lissy knelt down in front of Frank as she continued to stare into his eyes, into his very soul, for that was who she was speaking to. "Frank, they didn't leave you by choice. Do you think, given the choice, they would have ever left you? We can't be bitter about things we can't control. We just can't. It's senseless and it hurts no one but ourselves. It's like holding on to a hot coal you plan to eventually throw at an enemy. I have no doubt their love for you is just as strong now as it was then. Can you try, just for a moment, Frank, to feel their love for you again?" She pleaded with tears in her eyes. The entity began to lose its grip as it snapped and bit at him, but Frank's glow, once again, began growing gradually. "Grandkids, Frank?" 10 of them. 10, Frank replied through tears and a trembling voice. "Wow, 10. Frank, that's incredible. I got 2 great-grandkids," he said, as the corner of his mouth attempted a smile once again. "Frank, I dream every day to be surrounded by that much love when I'm your age. What a life you must have lived," Lissy said. I guess I've had a pretty decent life," Frank replied weakly, as if he were attempting to convince himself of his own truth. "Well, I'd love to hear your stories, Frank. I love stories. Stories about the good times, the bad times, and everything in between, because that's what made you who you are. Would you want to share those stories with me sometime, Frank? She asked. She was genuinely interested in hearing about his life, but also wanted to know at what point Frank's life the beast was able to attach so that she could potentially help others in the future. His glow grew to fill the room as he finally began to feel her genuine kindness, her love, and her empathy. His glow grew so bright, so massive that the beast could no longer maintain its grip on its host. Eventually, the beast tired and dropped from the old man's tired body. It shrieked wildly as it scuttled across the floor as a cockroach would before jumping out of an open 6th-floor window. Is it gone? Frank asked, his bottom lip trembling. This took Lizzie by surprise, and she struggled for the right words to reply. I called it the warden, because it was like being locked in a jail cell within my own mind. I could shout through the metal bars, but the warden was always there. Sometimes I'd go to sleep and lose chunks of time, sometimes small chunks, sometimes big uns. One minute I'd be working on my truck, and then I'd be waking up standing in the middle of the neighbor's garage with a jug of antifreeze in my hands and a dead cat at my feet. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hands. Hours, then days, sometimes weeks, he wept. But I felt its fear when it realized you could see it. I felt it. A weakness. So I fought it. Lissy kissed the top of Frank's hands and then set them back gently in his lap. Thank you so much, miss. He wept. Truly. From the bottom of my heart. Suddenly, the creature shrieked again somewhere close, too close, perhaps just outside the window. It was an eardrum-bursting, shrill, sharp sound which startled Lizzie and caused immeasurable pain within her body. She brought her hands to her ears to muffle the sound and fell to the floor in agony. She felt as if shards of glass were bouncing around inside her skull, ripping her brain to shreds. Blood began to trickle from her ears and then her nose as she sat with her knees drawn to her chest at Frank's feet. When it finally ceased, Lissy released her hands from her ears, but all she could hear was a loud ringing as the room blurred and spun out of control. She reached up for Frank, but her equilibrium was gone. Her stomach twisted violently, and bile began to make its way up to her esophagus, but she fought the urge to vomit. "Frank!" she pleaded, but the ringing in her ears was too loud to hear anything over, including the sound of her own voice. She used her hands to find his, then squeezed them, but Frank didn't squeeze back. His hands fell lifelessly onto his lap. "Frank!" Lizzie shouted once more as she struggled to get to her knees. She took a hold of his hands once again, this time pushing her fingers into his wrists to feel for a pulse. She felt none. When the room slowed just enough, she saw the blood. A thick, steady stream of scarlet gore poured from within his eyes, his ears, and his nose, while his jaw hung open in a morbid, silent scream. "Frank, no!" She wept into his lap as she held his hands. "You fought it! You beat it! You made it this far!" A hiss, a whisper no louder than the delicate burning of cigarette paper spoke over the deafening ringing within Lissy's mind and said, "It was but a piece of a whole, a fraction of a shadow which is as natural as life itself. And it has returned to me and told me of your sin against it. We feast only on those who allow us in. It is law. They need only to allow the darkness to tip their scales within their mind for the door to be opened for us to enter. You see, girl, he, your precious pet you've aimed to save, was gone long ago. You did not rescue him. Do not leave this room thinking you've done well, girl. His mind sacrificed itself long ago to provide sustenance for the darkness. You've simply removed our spoon. We will find another. We always do. Lissy did not bother to reply for 3 reasons. 1, she didn't have the right words in that moment. What do you say to the darkness itself anyway? 2, she knew deep within the depths of her very soul that she had been given this gift for a reason. If she could suddenly not only see these things, these beastly creatures, these broken pieces of darkness that feasted on the minds of those who had given up, there had to be a reason for it. And most importantly, perhaps, reason number 3, Frank had been squeezing her hands within his own as the darkness spoke. Frank was alive. The end.